everybody, I am Jarrett Ross, a Genie Vlogger, and welcome back to another video where I review your DNA and genealogy questions. As always, if you want to ask a question for me to answer on one of these videos, be sure to go to my subreddit r/GenieVlogger and post it there. But let's jump into it. Mysterious readings of Jewish ancestry for both of my grandfathers. Earlier this year, I tested my grandparents on Ancestry DNA and uploaded their results to GEDmatch, MyHeritage, and FTDNA. Both grandparents' ancestries are from Greece, the first from Tripoli and the second from northern Greece. Regarding the first, he scored 2.2% Ashkenazi Jewish on MyHeritage and less than 1% Ashkenazi on Family Tree DNA, with Jewish DNA matches mainly from Poland. I know Tripoli was the home of the Jews in the Peloponnese before 1821, but to my knowledge they were Romaniote. Basically, is it likely that this Ashkenazi Jewish reading is accurate, or is it misleading for Romaniote Jewish? And how would that account for the Ashkenazi DNA matches? Regarding the second, his mother has ancestry from Kirklareli, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing wrong, in Constantinople, where there were large Sephardic communities, and his father from around Thessalonica, where there was the largest Sephardic community since the 1500s. He scores less than 4% Sephardic Jewish and less than 2% Mizrahi Jewish on FTDNA only, but also less than 4% Irish, which I believe Spanish people score due to Celtic influence in Spain, where the Sephardic Jews originated before coming to Greece. So, is it likely that he really does have a Sephardic ancestry despite no other company picking up on it? Also, are there any good resources to research Sephardic ancestry from these regions? Thanks, any advice is appreciated. Okay, so technically we have two questions here that are basically the same thing, basically looking at each grandfather and asking, are these Jewish readings correct? And for the first grandfather, you do mention having DNA matches mainly from Poland, who are Jewish DNA matches. But the question that I have for you there, are these matches almost fully Jewish, like 100% or 90+%? Yeah, you say MyHeritage and FTDNA, so you should be able to see that. So if you do have matches that are almost completely Jewish, really high readings, where it's the majority of their family ancestry that's Jewish ancestry, then yes, it is likely that you do have some sort of Jewish ancestry within the past couple hundred years through that grandfather. And if that is the case, that you do have some sort of Jewish ancestry, based on the DNA readings, you won't be able to determine whether or not it's Ashkenazi or something else like Romaniote. Part of this has to do with the difficulty of reading DNA and deciphering between the different groups, but it also has to do with a lack of DNA studies from different population groups within the Jewish diaspora as well. But the most likely thing is that it will show up in your genetic matches. So if you do have a lot of Jewish matches, but all of them are only tracing to Poland, then to me that seems more indicative that if you do have Jewish ancestry, it's probably going to be connected through some sort of Polish Jewish ancestry. Whereas if you had Romaniote Jewish ancestry, you would probably be seeing people where that's what their family trees indicate. And I know a lot of people like to assume that, you know, whatever areas they're kind of getting, they try to think of like historical communities in that area or something like that. Well, yeah, that's a consideration. It's just one of the many considerations, and so just because Romaniotes were in that area for a longer amount of time doesn't really negate the fact that it's certainly possible 200, 300 years ago there was some guy who was a Polish Jew who went and traveled then to Greece and lived there. Or Tripoli, excuse me, I'm starting to get it mixed up with the second grandfather, but to go on to the second grandfather, in a similar way, for him, he's getting that Sephardic Jewish and Mizrahi Jewish readings on Family Tree DNA, but you said that there weren't any other sort of Jewish readings anywhere, but he does come from areas that do have known Sephardic communities, and certainly a bunch of communities that I've heard that are part of what's known as the Eastern Sephardic Wave. So the Jewish Sephardic diaspora is usually broken up into three main waves. There's the Eastern Sephardic Wave, which left mostly before 1492. Then there's the North African Sephardic Wave, which left around 1491 and 1492, basically once Spain was reconquered by the Catholics. And then the third wave, which is known as the Western Sephardic diaspora, which is the Jews that left mostly after 1492, too, many of who had actually gone to Portugal first, because the Inquisition wasn't enacted in Portugal in 1492. It was enacted much later. But once that was enacted in Portugal, then all of those Jews left. And that's something that many people know as La Nación, or the Portuguese Jewish nation, the Portuguese Hebrew nation. There's a whole bunch of variations of that. So quick little history lesson in there. But for you, I would say that it's the similar thing with what we have with the other grandfather. Look at your matches and see, do you have matches that are of mostly Jewish ancestry? So for the second grandfather, it's certainly possible that maybe you look at the matches and you're not finding a bunch that are almost 100% Jewish, but you are finding a bunch where they do have some sort of ancestry, which does trace to the Sephardic community of Thessalonica. Well, if that's the case, then that would be very indicative that maybe these percentages are right. But now, with all of that said on both grandfathers, the thing to keep in mind is that it could be possible either way. It's just a matter of how confident you might be in the possibility of this ancestry, and then later down the line, whether or not you can prove it with the paper trail, which it seems that is one of your goals, because you are asking, where are resources? But for myself, I usually consider anything under 5% a trace result. And what do I mean by a trace result? I just mean that it is a result that has a low confidence to it. It doesn't mean that it's not true, but just by being a trace result, literally just meaning for me under 5%. Although I think for different genealogists, they view it differently, and then it can be viewed differently on different sites and all that I won't go into. But basically, if you have a 1% reading, the confidence is really, really low whether or not that's true. It could be true, and maybe you do have some very distant ancestry there, but it's going to be very difficult to prove for many different people. So you definitely will have to dig deeper for both grandfathers to see if this is true. But I do think that from what you say in here, it seems you have a decent grasp of what is going on. And now it's just a matter of actually trying to be able to prove it. On to the next one. Mine and my dad's Ancestry DNA results. And we have two different DNA results posted. I'm guessing it's the OP and their father. I was lucky to find paper trails I found on my dad's grandfather's side. I found out that his great-grandfather's middle name is a surname, Ryson Scribner Smith Jr. His grandfather's surname is Scribner, and I found the Scribner name in the Maine and New Hampshire areas. Okay, so I guess this person doesn't have a question, or at least if they did it on Post Insights, which I should say, please do not post your question in Post Insights, because as you can see, Insights are only available for 45 days after post creation, and it takes me a really long time to get to these questions because I can only answer 4 or 5 questions a video, and I usually only do one video every other week, so that means that I'm doing, it's difficult. And you can see this one's from 8 months ago. So Smith Pennington 1984, if you had a question, I'm sorry, I don't know what it is, but let's look at your results. England, Northwestern Europe, Scotland, Sweden and Denmark, Germanic Europe, Norway, and then DNA communities, which is the most important part. Eastern Kentucky and Northeast Tennessee settlers, Lower Midwest and Virginia settlers, South Central Appalachia settlers. So this person, I'm guessing, has a very, very long ancestry in the United States, or I guess you could technically say America either way. On to the second. So maybe the father, I don't know. Typical Northwest European mixtures, and then same thing, Eastern Kentucky, Northeast Tennessee settlers and South Central Appalachia settlers. So I'm guessing if that's your dad, then that means that the lower Midwest and Virginia settlers must be coming from your mom's side, whereas the Tennessee settlers and Appalachia settlers are your dad's side. So don't know if you had a question, but that's my review of your DNA. On to the next one. Odd DNA results from the different sites. I did a DNA test through 23andMe last year, and a pretty clear result. I was 80% Scandinavian, Swedish specifically, 5% Finnish, and the rest was broadly Western European. My results have since been updated with clear percentages, which I will be pictured with this post. I've done pretty extensive genealogical research research and have found Finnish ancestors on my paternal grandfather's side, whose side of the family is from the most northern part of Sweden, where Finnish interaction was a lot more common. Aside from this, and another connection that my father has to the Swedish nobility of the late 1700s, which then has a family tree that includes both Scandinavian and European monarchs, as well as a whole bunch of nobles. Aside from that, basically everything is Swedish. I've also uploaded it to all the different sites. DNA results from the upload of MyHeritage was the one that's, included a decent chunk of Irish, Scottish, and Welsh, about 17%. This seemed quite strange since I haven't found anything like this in either of my genealogical research or previous DNA results. As far as I understand, the Irish, Scottish, and Welsh are the groups within the British Isles that still is largely Celtic, as opposed to the English, which is basically entirely Germanic, which I assume would make them genetically distinguishable. If it isn't a misreading of my DNA, then I only have a wild and unrealistic theory, which is that someone of my Viking ancestors, which is in Dublin or some other Viking settlement in Ireland or Scotland, was very genetically successful, thus providing me with these odd results. I'd love to hear others' opinion on these results. So first, we have the 99.9% Northwestern European, Scandinavian 98.8%, Finnish 1.1%. Then for MyHeritage, 63.4%, 17.1%, 8.7%. Okay. Basically, what you're dealing with here is that typical Northwestern European admixture. And the thing that stands out to me is that you are only getting this reading through MyHeritage. So the fact that that's happening makes it very, very questionable whether or not that's actually true, or whether it's some sort of misreading just because of how MyHeritage does their admixtures. Now, considering that these tests are basically looking at the past couple hundred years, you could maybe say 500 years at the most, but usually it's more about 200 to 300 years that you're really looking at with these DNA tests. So if you have your entire family tree traced out a couple hundred years back on every single branch, then that makes it even more questionable in the sense that you have a very high percentage of Irish, Scottish, and Welsh. 17%. And 17% is usually indicative of about a great-grandparent. It's actually a little bit higher than what you'd expect for a great-grandparent. That's assuming it's coming from just one ancestor, though. So if this is true, then yeah, it's probably coming from more distant ancestors. But I should really say that this is really where the whole admixture thing really kind of annoys genealogists such as myself, in that people really, really start to read too in-depth into these. The truth is that there's so many possibilities of what could be going on here. So as an example, you say, what if one of my Viking ancestors who was in Dublin or some other Viking settlement in Ireland or Scotland was very genetically successful, thus providing me with these odd results? That could be the possibility, or there could be a billion other possibilities throughout all of the ages of someone going from Scotland, Ireland, or Wales to Scandinavia, or from Scandinavia to Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. They could have been Vikings, they could have been somebody else, it could have been, something very, very different, or it could just be a misread. And this is part of the problem with these genetic admixtures, is people will see it and it's like, oh, all of a sudden it's like the wheels start turning and people really come up with all these grandiose ideas, especially based on things that people love to talk about. So Vikings is one of the things that always comes up whenever anybody has any sort of Scandinavian ancestry, which, yeah, I totally get why, but at the same time, it's like, that might not be the only reason. In fact, it's not going to be the only reason why there's a lot of mixture between a lot of the people in Scandinavia and the British Isles and Northwestern European as a whole. And then, of course, just the simple consideration that it is just a misreading in the fact that MyHeritage is trying to do something fanciful with how they do their admixture, and because of that, it's coming out a little wonky. And in all honesty, MyHeritage is one of the ones that I probably hear from more people than any of the other DNA tests saying that they don't like how the admixture comes out, or that it is the least accurate that they can tell based on their family trees. So from a genealogical standpoint, the fact that you've got a really, really well built out family tree, and these are really only telling you the past 200 to 300 years, assuming that family tree goes to that 200 to 300 year mark and possibly beyond on a lot of these branches, more than likely this is just some sort of misreading. So just to throw in one last little flip there, so let's say it's not a misread and let's say it's not Vikings. Maybe instead there was some guy from Ireland 400 years ago who then traveled to Sweden and then had a big family with tons of kids. And then those kids had tons of kids. And then hundreds of years later, there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of Swedish people who have DNA from this guy from Ireland. And because of that, that's why there's misreadings like this. Or maybe there was a big boat of Irish guys who landed in some place in Norway and started a big old family there. So think about this. If you travel to any place in the world that is a very, very different population group than yourself. So like myself, I'm an American Jew. Let's say I were to move to India. And then I had a family with someone in India who was fully 100% Indian ancestry. And I had a bunch of kids with them. And then those kids had a bunch of other kids with other people and so on. Within a few generations, you could have hundreds of people that now have American Jewish ancestry but live in India. And let's say that maybe even more, I go there as well as a first cousin of mine, and we both have families. So the main point I'm just really getting at is there are so many possibilities of how these different ancestries could get into somebody's admixture. So because of that, you really just can't jump to too many conclusions about where could it be coming from, which is unfortunately what I see most people doing. Hopefully that was helpful and not me rambling too much, but on to the next one. Some jokes in these frustrating times. So let's check this out. This is going to be a full video. I like that this says none, but non-Northern Europeans, because a lot of people are always saying, you know, oh, Europeans have the best representation. And it's like, well, depends on which Europeans you're talking about. Yeah. Oh, man. What an ending. What an ending there. Oh. Wow. Jeez, find a grave users when kids die in shootings. That is unfortunately true, but messed up. So, wow. On to the next one. When and how to contact matches. Under which conditions should you contact a match? How much mystery or centimorgan should there be? What do you say in your message? And from experience, what is the approximate reply quota? Honestly, I haven't had anyone ever reply to me on Ancestry or MyHeritage, but I've contacted too many people either. Any tips on how to get more replies / better ones? How far away genetically is too far away for such a contact to be helpful? Bonus questions. 1, how does endogamy influence this? Because that throws off the shared amount of centimorgans quite a bit. 2, how would you approach this if an unexpectedly close stranger shows up as a match? Not necessarily talking secret dad here or something, more like first to second cousin. You cannot put your finger on how they could be related. And then edit. Also, does the rule of thumb vary? Like one should assume that people on GEDmatch might be more interested in actual tree building than in other places where many people just test for the ethnicity estimates. Now this question is one that I actually asked this person to ask on here because they asked it in the Discord and I thought it was a really good question, which brings me to a good point of if you haven't checked out the Genie Vlogger Discord, be sure to check it out. It's going to be linked below. I do interact with the community a lot there. Sometimes I do answer questions, but especially if I see cool stuff or anything like that, in Discord, I'll sometimes suggest people to post it in Reddit if I want to have it in a video. So the main thing here is contacting matches, which is a big, big part of genetic genealogy, because to do genetic genealogy, you need to figure out that person's family tree and your family tree so that you can then find how you connect. Now, deciding which matches to contact will vary from person to person based on a few different things. The first thing is, how much information do you have on your own family and on how you connect with this person? Something that I see people do a lot that I do not suggest at all is they contact every single match. And even worse, they get some sort of really generic thing that just says, hey, I'm a genetic match to you and I wanted to see if we could figure out how we're related. Thanks. Well, there are a lot of issues with that, and we're going to get into the reasons for that as I go through some of what you want to say when you do contact people. So the first thing is, when you contact someone, you need to have a reason to contact them other than, hey, you're a genetic match of mine, let's try to figure this out. So when you're looking for matches to contact, you need to see, do you have something that you can at least get an idea of, well, we might be related this way, or we have this in common, because you need to find a place where you can get proper footing. But one major thing that I definitely suggest that you do when you contact someone, let them know where you're matching, what website, as well as who you're matching to. Because there are a lot of people, such as myself, that handle hundreds of kits all over all these different websites. And when I get an email saying, hey, I matched you, want to figure out how we're related, I get so angry because, number one, who are you matching? Number two, where are you matching? And number three, what's the information on your family? How do we connect? You didn't give me anything. So one other thing that you should do when you contact someone is you should give them information on your family, but with a major caveat. Do not write a massive paragraph or a huge email. One of the things that I do see people doing from time to time is that they send an absolute novel of an email, and it's very overwhelming to get an email from someone you don't know where there's like 5 attachments and it's like 6 paragraphs and it's going to take at least 20 minutes to read. The only time that that type of thing would work is if you're contacting someone like myself who's really, really into genealogy. But if you send something like that to someone who's only kind of into it, maybe they've dabbled a bit in the tree, maybe they have contacted genetic matches, but then they get an email like that, basically this massive thing that takes forever to read and has all these different things to look at, that's going to be too much. And a lot of people may just kind of say, I'll get to it later, and then never get to it. So the trick is to give some information, but not too much. Basically give I'm on this website, I'm matching this person or this kit, and I believe that we're connected through this way, or I noticed this. So basically giving enough that that person can then look at things to see, oh yeah, there is this correlation, or oh, I do see this connection, or oh, that seems familiar to me. And then they can easily look and then give you a contact back, and you have a strong footing to get started. Now, as for the question of who to decide to contact, I know I kind of glossed over that. And part of the reason is because it does vary from person to person. And one of the things that you do ask about, does endogamy influence this? It will vary from population group to population group as well because of endogamy and other things. So for anyone who's Jewish, you're going to be much more selective in who you're going to contact because you're dealing with endogamy, and that means that you're going to have a whole lot of matches where they seem a lot closer than they really are. But another thing with Jewish ancestry that makes it more difficult is that most people with Jewish ancestry aren't able to trace back further than the mid-1800s. For most people of Jewish ancestry, that's about it. If you're lucky, you can get a little bit further than that, but most people, it's very, very rare. So you're dealing with a big difficulty in being able to connect with these much more distant matches, because for a lot of people of Jewish ancestry, you're usually lucky to get matches that you can tell where they're a third or fourth cousin and actually connect on a family tree. But then if you come from a population that you aren't dealing with any sort of endogamy and you have this big, big paper trail, then you're going to have a lot more matches that will be worthwhile to contact, because if you have a very large tree, you have something easily to reference. That also means you're going to have more genetic matches. So when you look at a genetic match and you're trying to decide, should I contact them? One thing to look at is, what are your shared matches? Because if they have a lot of shared matches with you where they're coming from one specific side of your family, then when you're contacting this person, you can say, well, I noticed you're matching a lot of people from this side of my family, so I think this is where we connect. So somebody coming from a population group with really great records that has these really well fleshed out trees, they're going to have that possibility a lot more often than someone of African American ancestry, where, similar to people of Jewish ancestry, they're going to hit a major brick wall in the 1800s. And while some people of African American ancestry can trace back further than that, they are going to have a lot of difficulty. And so when you're trying to figure out a match there, you aren't going to be as selective as someone who's Jewish because you aren't really dealing with the same endogamy issues, basically matches looking closer, but you are going to be dealing with those same issues of being limited because you have too little of a family tree and your matches have too little of a family tree to be able to even come up with an idea of where in those trees you might be related. But to get to the approximate reply quota, that one's really difficult to answer, but it is definitely on the much smaller side of things. I would say maybe like a 10% reply, because you are going to have a lot of people that don't reply for different reasons. For one, especially at this point in time, you're going to have a lot of people that aren't going to reply just because they tested, they looked at the results, and they haven't logged back in since. Being that these tests have been up for over a decade, there's probably a lot of people who have tested as well that have since passed away. But then you also have a lot of people that really just have no interest in this, and you may send a message. Some of the sites or some of the different ways you can message, I think it will show if it's read or not. Not 100% sure on that. But for some cases, you're going to send the message, they'll get it, they'll read it, they're just not going to respond. So it's definitely best to just expect no responses, because that way when you do get a response, it's much happier than when you're only getting one response out of the 10 you sent. Then, oh, I actually got a response. Sweet, I wasn't expecting one. So, there is that little trick. And then the last two questions related to this: how would you approach it if an unexpected close stranger showed up as a match? That one's really difficult for me to answer. I've never actually had that personally happen. I've never dealt with any situations like that, so I'm not quite sure how to answer that. I guess it would vary. Is it someone that you actually are friendly with, or is it someone that you kind of have had beef with in the past, or, is it just someone that you're acquainted with, or, I guess there's a lot of different things to consider in a situation like that, and whether or not you'd actually want to say, oh, hey, I see that you're actually my cousin. Although I think finding out that someone is a cousin or something really isn't as world shaking as finding out that, your dad isn't your dad, or at least, the dad you thought that was your dad isn't your biological dad. So I guess it would also depend on how far distantly related they were. But to get to the last thing, would the rule of thumb vary depending on which websites that you're using? Basically, would one website seem like the people are more interested than others? And I think that there is some possibility with that. Considering whether or not someone is more into this stuff is definitely helpful. If you find somebody who's a genetic match and you look them up and you see, oh wow, they do a lot of genealogy and a lot of different stuff, yeah, there's a higher chance that you're going to get a response from them, and they're probably going to be a better person to contact. But when it comes down to the websites, you can kind of apply that, and some of the websites give you some things that can give you an idea too. So like on Ancestry, that's a website that has the largest database, which also means it has the largest amount of users who aren't interested in this stuff. Whether there's a higher percentage or lower percentage, I'm not sure. But with Ancestry, if you look at a match and you go and click on their profile and see they haven't logged in a year, you're probably going to be a little bit more hesitant to contact them than when you look at another match and you see that they logged in just the other day. And then for the same thing with each different website, I think it could vary, but it's really hard to say, because I'm thinking on each time I've contacted people through all the different websites, and I feel like it's always been about the same, whether it's on GEDmatch or Family Tree or 23andMe, MyHeritage, or whatever. So I don't really think that would at least sway me in deciding who I would contact over others. But I guess one way that I would say it is if I do see someone in multiple databases, that would sway me to probably contact them, because if someone's usually in multiple databases, they're usually trying to find genetic matches, because someone who's interested in just the ethnicity percentages usually will test just one place. Maybe they'll test in a few places, but rarely. And oftentimes with some of these different websites, you have to opt in to start the matching. Like Family Tree DNA does that. 23andMe does that. The other ones you have to consent, but I don't know if you can opt out of the matching. But basically, there's a lot of people that are going to be in those databases that you're just not going to see because they didn't even opt in to match. So if you are seeing them on multiple sites, then that could be a good indicator. But I definitely don't want to dissuade anyone from contacting matches because it really is one of the best parts about being able to further the genealogy research through the DNA matching. Plus, you just never know what these cousins might have, all sorts of photos of the family, all sorts of documents that might not be available online, and a whole bunch of other crazy stuff. But I think that it is especially useful for anyone coming from these population groups that have major difficulties in tracing their family trees. So as before, I mentioned people with Jewish ancestry and people with African American ancestry. And in a recent video that I reacted to, there was someone who had African American ancestry who was able to really trace out his family tree really well using DNA. So if you'd like to check that out, be sure to click right here. And if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. That really does help me out. You can also click right about here if you'd like to subscribe. It is completely free to do so. You can also follow me at Genie Vlogger on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. I'm the Genie Vlogger. See you in my next video.